this evening is Sophie Reynolds, Collections and Interpretation Manager for the museum since 2018. Sophie studied English, writing and performance at York and has been published extensively. In 2013, she was poet in residence at the New Diorama Theatre in London, and she's also written an all-female adaptation of Ibsen's The Doll's House, the Theatre Delicatessen. We're really delighted she's been able to give us her time this evening, and after the tour, she's there to answer your questions. Now, before we start, can I just please remind you all to switch off your video and go on mute while Sophie is talking, but please switch yourselves back on afterwards for the questions so we can see and hear you. And don't forget, there's also the chat room if you want to write your questions down. Okay, so it's over to Sophie, and enjoy the evening, everyone.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Diana. That was a lovely introduction. My name's Sophie, and I work at Jane Austen's house in Chawton. And I'm really so delighted to be here tonight to, well, at home, actually. So it's probably the most comfortable talk I've ever done. And I'm glad that you're all at home too. I hope that you're sitting comfortably and that you've got a cup of tea with you or a glass of wine and that you're getting ready to enjoy. I'm going to be talking about Jane Austen really in the context of her home in Chawton. And to tell that story, I'm going to use a number of objects from the museum collection. But, as Diana's just told us, Jane was 33 when she moved to Chawton. So before we get there, I'm just going to give you the most whistle-stop tour of her life, a history, you might say, by a prejudiced and by no means impartial observer. Because, as you might guess, I'm an Austen devotee, and I imagine that you are too. So we're always going to come down on her side. So to begin with, and I'm sure that many of you know this already, but just so that we're all on the same page, Jane Austen was born in the small village of Steventon in Hampshire, quite near Basingstoke, in December of 1775. And we're going to dive straight into the collection now to help tell this story. So bear with me for just a moment. Right, so here we are. This is a pencil drawing of Steventon Rectory from the museum's collection. And it was actually drawn by Ben Lefroy, who was married to Jane Austen's niece, Anna. And she was the daughter of Jane's eldest brother, James. Sorry, let me just let some more people in. Who took over the living of Steventon in 1801 when his father moved to Bath with his wife. Sorry, let me let in some more people. Hello, everyone who's just joined. So we're now in Steventon. We're just beginning her life story. So this drawing is dated 1820. So although Jane wasn't actually living here at the time when this was drawn, it does give us a really accurate idea of what her childhood home looked like. And coincidentally, there was actually a great flood in Steventon in 1820, presumably just very shortly after this was drawn. And it resulted in the rectory being dismantled and completely removed and rebuilt in a different place. So this sketch is particularly precious because it represents a last look at that house before it vanished. And today, this site is just an open, empty field. So it's really lovely to have this record of it to show what the house looked like then. So this is Jane's family. Or some of them anyway, most of them, in miniatures from the museum collection. And at the top there, we've got Mr. and Mrs. Austen, and then along the bottom, we've got nearly all of her brothers. Jane actually had 6 brothers. The second one is missing, but we do have 5 of them there, and her sister Cassandra in the middle, who she was really close to throughout her life. The Austens were a large, noisy, affectionate, creative, and intelligent family, and very talented. So there we have this sort of picture of her growing up in this creative, fun, busy environment, full of children, full of boys, and I think that's particularly important for her story. Then in 1801, when Jane was 25, her father retired and moved the family to Bath. However, he died shortly afterwards, a couple of years later, and he left his 2 daughters and his wife with a very small income and with no fixed home. So they spent the next few years moving around, living in different places, smaller and smaller houses, renting different places, staying with friends. They moved to Southampton, where they lived with Jane's brother Frank and his wife, and they went on visits to relatives. But it was an unsettled time. It was a difficult time for them all, but particularly for Jane, because she was trying to be a writer, and actually during this period she does write some bits and pieces. She experiments, but she doesn't do sort of solid work during this time. Then in 1809, and this is where our story really gets going, her brother Edward, her 3rd brother, and it's actually, I don't know if you can see, but the second from the right down here in the square frame, not a very flattering picture of him actually, but that's Edward. He offers them a home, and that's where the story in Chawton really begins. So this is Edward Knight, and as you can see, he is every inch the landed gentleman. Unlike the rest of the family and all of Jane's other brothers, he has no profession. And how is this? How has he managed to do this? In many ways, it's really just the luck of the draw. He was an attractive child. He had lovely golden curls and rather a cherubic expression, perhaps. And he caught the eye of some distant relatives called the Knights, who were travelling through Steventon on their honeymoon. They came to visit their relatives, the Austens, and they took a fancy to young Edward. He was 5 years old at the time, and they actually picked him up with them and took him on their honeymoon, which sounds kind of crazy, I think, to today's society, but was quite common at the time. That wasn't a very unusual practice. And the Knights continued to take an interest in Edward. And a few years later, it started to become apparent that they weren't going to have children of their own, and they were very well off. They had estates in Kent and in Hampshire, and it was really important that they had an heir to leave those estates to. So they started to take more of an interest in Edward, and it became, it became apparent. The Austens understood that he would be their heir, and they actually formally adopted him, and he ended up taking the name of Knight, and he inherited these great estates. So this particular portrait isn't in the museum collection. It's actually enormous. It did used to hang in the house at the museum a while ago, but it was far too big. It was rather uncomfortable there. So it now hangs at Chawton House, which is the great house just down the road from us, which was Edward's seat when he was living in that part of the country. So Edward inherited 3 estates, 2 in Hampshire. There was Steventon, where Jane Austen was born and had grown up. There was Chawton, where she ended her life, and his main estate was actually in Kent, and it was Godmersham. So in 1809, he offered his mother and his 2 sisters a house rent-free for the rest of their lives, and he gave them a choice. He said that they could have a house on his estate at Godmersham in Kent or in Chawton in Hampshire. And we're not entirely sure why they chose Chawton. I'm a bit biased. I think it may have been because it was just wonderful. It's lovely. It's a beautiful, idyllic place. It may have been partly because of its proximity to Steventon. It's really quite close. I mean, today it's a half-an-hour drive. Obviously, in those days, that was a little bit longer, but it was the same county. There would have been people that they knew, neighbours that they would have been able to visit. Also, there's the little church of St Nicholas just down the road. That may have been an inducement to them. And also the proximity to Chawton Great House, which is just up the road, a very short stroll away. And whilst Edward didn't live there for the majority of the time that they lived in Chawton, there would have been neighbours there, society, people that they could have mixed with. So that may have been an inducement as well. So now, finally, we get to the house. And here we are. So in 1809, they're moving to Chawton. And actually, at that time, I don't think the house would have looked very different to how it does today. There have been a few changes since then. For example, there's the museum sign over the door. I don't think they would have had one of those. And also you'll notice there's this wide grassy verge that we have at the moment that separates us from the village road. When the Austens lived there, that wasn't there. The road ran much closer to the house. And in those days too, the road would have been much busier. It was actually a main coaching road between London and Winchester. So there were coaches going past, people on horseback. There was quite a lot of traffic, made it quite a busy, quite an interesting place to be in some ways. Today, Chawton, there's a bypass. So Chawton only, has local traffic. It's very quiet and secluded and idyllic. And I think people find that quite interesting, that idea that actually when the Austens were there, it was quite a lot busier than it is today. So the Austens moved in, Mrs. Austen, Cassandra and Jane, and also their friend Martha Lloyd, who was also unmarried. And together they joined forces, they pooled their resources, and they formed a really stable and comfortable all-female household. And that was where Jane was able to really sort of do some of her great work. So let's go inside. This is a sketch, an illustration of the drawing room inside Chawton Cottage, and it's taken from a book called Jane Austen, Her Homes and Her Friends by Constance Hill, and it was published in 1901. And it looks very similar to how it is today. Very little has changed. It shows the fireplace in the drawing room, and of course there on the table is Jane Austen's writing desk, which is now in the British Library. She's got a shawl thrown casually over the back of a chair. It all looks rather cosy, I think, and rather lovely. And I think it sort of sums up this idea that I have of when Jane was living in Chawton. It's generally believed that she was very happy when she was living there. It was finally, after all these years of moving around and not really having a settled home, nothing being stable, not really knowing, quite how to make ends meet and quite where you were going to have to live next. She finally is in this settled home. They know that they can stay there. It's rent-free, it's safe, it's secure, and it's generally believed that Jane was happy living here. She finally had the space and time in which to write. And her family really supported her in that, especially Cassandra, who took on the majority of the running of the household, which gave Jane that precious time to write, which she so craved. And she was, in fact, incredibly productive here. We've got to remember that when Jane and the other Austen ladies moved to Chawton, Jane hadn't had anything published by this point. She tried really hard. She's been trying for years. She's got manuscripts ready to go and she's been sending them to publishers, but nothing's happened yet. So she's desperate. But they move in and she very quickly sets about revising Sense and Sensibility. And in 1811, it is published, which is a triumph. And here it is. So this is a first edition from the museum's collection, and it reminds us that Jane Austen's name didn't appear on it, and her name never appeared on one of her works during her lifetime. Instead, it says by a lady, and I think we could go down a whole nother talk on this, on Jane Austen and feminism and what she's saying in those three little words, but we don't have time. We've got to stay on track. We're going to stay with the house. After Sense and Sensibility had come out, Jane Austen revised and published Pride and Prejudice and Mansfield Park. She wrote Emma, she revised Northanger Abbey, she wrote Persuasion, and she was just beginning work on Sanditon. So 8 years, she was quite prolific. And then, of course, to finish the story of her life whilst she's in Chawton, we sadly reach her death, because just 8 years after moving to Chawton, she removed to Winchester to be nearer to her doctor at the county hospital, and there she died. She was 41, and we don't know the exact cause of her death. We think it was probably some kind of cancer, but here is her gravestone in Winchester Cathedral. So now, we'll skip forward 20 or 30 years, and now we're in the mid-1800s. And at this time, Jane Austen isn't actually a particularly popular writer. She's seen as a bit highbrow, a little bit difficult perhaps. Her novels are read and admired by the literary elite, but they're not generally publicly enjoyed by the sort of the general populace. But all of that is about to change. So in 1869, James Edward Austen Leigh, Jane's nephew, wrote and published this memoir of Jane Austen. And this is a first edition from the museum's collection again. And this book really kick-started Jane Austen's ascent to fame in many ways. It reintroduced the general public to her works, and it generated really popular interest in them. And there's an awful lot more that we could say about this as well, because this book actually also kick-started a number of really unhelpful ideas about what Jane Austen was like as a person. It portrayed her as the kind of Victorian domestic ideal, who was very unambitious and only just happened to write her novels by accident, which I think we all know now is absolutely impossible, could not have been the case. However, we're going to stay with the story of the house. So the main thing to bear in mind is that Jane Austen is now becoming popular. So now we're going to skip forward again a little bit. And this is a photo of the house in 1947. So it's just 2 years before it opened as a museum. And this is an image, it's actually a newspaper clipping from the museum archive. So what's happened to get to the house at this point? And I don't know if you can tell from the picture, but it's in a bit of a state by now. So what's happened to it? So after Jane Austen's death in 1817, Cassandra and Mrs. Austen stayed living at the house until Cassandra's death. Mrs. Austen died. Cassandra stayed there until her own death in 1845. And at that point, the house reverted to the Chawton estate, which was still owned by her brother Edward. It was divided up into tenements for labourers on the estate to live in. And it was actually lived in by 3 different families. They chopped the house up a little bit in order to make that work. They put in a staircase. They moved some walls around a little bit. They added some bits. So we have 3 families living in the house, and also downstairs, the beautiful drawing room is used as an estate office, and it's also used as a club room for men in the village. So I don't know, I'm imagining darts or a pool table, men sitting around with newspapers and their pipes. So as often happens when a building is occupied by a number of different people and nobody is really taking responsibility for its upkeep, it begins to fall into disrepair and things are going wrong and it's not feeling very looked after. And around about this time, just before this photograph was taken, in 1940, we get the birth of the Jane Austen Society, and that is completely 100% linked to the state of the house. What happened was this. In 1940, a local woman called Dorothy Darnell, who lived in Alton, was walking past the house. She knew that that was where Jane Austen had lived. There's a plaque on the wall which commemorates it, which was put up in 1917. So she knows that it's where Jane Austen lived, and she's a huge fan of Jane Austen, and she finds it so sad that the house is just so neglected and that nobody cares, nobody knows that it's a special place. So she decides to set up the Jane Austen Society with the specific intent of saving the house and setting it up as a museum. So she set up the society in 1940 and they begin some work. What do? So if you are trying to raise money to set up a museum in the 40s, what you do is place adverts in the newspapers. That's the best way of communicating with people. So a few years later, this is actually, I'm sorry about the resolution of this. It's not such great quality, but it's a picture from the archive again from 1946. It's the Times. And this is an appeal that Dorothy Darnell and the Jane Austen Society put in the newspapers to try to raise money to save the house and to attract members. And obviously, membership fees and donations to the society. You know, they were gathering money all the time. They didn't have enough money at this point to buy the house. And it's the mid-40s, it's just after the war. Landowners are in real problems and the Chawton estate is being broken up. So there's an opportunity to buy the house, but there's not much time. It could go to somebody else and, you know, be lived in or knocked down. Goodness knows what's going to happen to it. So they're really pushing. And luckily, we have a fairy godfather, because in 1946, this advert catches the eye of a gentleman called Mr. T. Edward Carpenter, who lives in London. He's a lawyer. He's got nothing to do with Jane Austen, but he does love her work. And he decides to buy the house outright for the nation and to set it up as a museum. And he sets up the Jane Austen Memorial Trust, which is designed to work alongside the Jane Austen Society and to run the house as a museum. And he has another reason for wishing to do this, which is that his son had a few years earlier been killed in action in Italy in 1944, and he wants to memorialize him as part of his work in saving the house. He wants to dedicate the museum to his son Philip, and we can see, we can see here the plaque that was put up a few years later on the front wall of the house, which dedicates the house to Philip Carpenter's memory. And here we are on opening day. So this is 1949. It's actually the 23rd of July, and it's the formal opening of the house to the public, and the Duke of Wellington is there to cut the ribbon and declare the house open. And we have in the archive some really wonderful visitor books right up from that first day, starting in 1949. The Duke of Wellington is the first person to sign his name in the new visitor book. And ever since then, there's always been a visitor book out, and visitors have been encouraged or asked if they want to sign their names and add comments or where they're from. And there's this wonderful record of visitors over the last 70 years from all over the world. People have flocked to the house to see it. And as you can see in this rather charming photograph, there are lots of bowler hats and parasols in this wonderful crowd of people who've gathered to see the opening of the house, which I think is rather special. And here we have a little bit more from that time. So these are some really lovely scrapbooks from the early days of the museum. I really love digging around in the archive because it's just full of things like this. They're so lovely. And these pictures show some of that little band of men and women who worked so hard in the early days to open up the house and to really establish it as a museum. And I'm just going to move my mouse here. This is Dorothy Darnell standing with her handbag just on the front steps, which I think is really wonderful because she died a few years later. So it's really great that she got to see the opening, see her dream come to fruition. And now we're in the 1950s. So the house is open, although there are still tenants living in it. So I should have said that earlier, actually. When Mr. Carpenter bought the house, it came with sitting tenants. All three of them were still there. So he opened the house as a museum, but actually the only room that you could go into to begin with was the drawing room, which had been the club room. The other parts of the house were still occupied, and he actually had to, eventually what he did was buy up other houses locally, which he could move the tenants out into, slowly opening up more and more rooms until the whole of the house could be, or most of the house could be seen. As the decade goes on, the Trust manages to find these new homes, and they move the tenants out. And I just want to draw your attention to a couple of things that I think are just so charming about this advert. Firstly, that Mr. Carpenter has very trustingly put his address on the bottom of it, which I just think is extraordinary. It's a bit like our director today, I don't know, putting her mobile number on Twitter or something. I just don't think we're supposed to, you know, reveal that kind of information anymore. But also there's this really wonderful poem, which we actually still use all the time today, because Jane Austen was just incredibly helpful to us. She wrote a letter to her brother when they just moved into the house in 1809, and she wrote this really charming poem in it about the house and how much they loved it. So it goes, "Our Chawton home, how much we find already in it to our mind, and how convinced that when complete, it will all other houses beat. And obviously that's just a dream for a marketing person now, so that's we use it all the time. So we're inside the house. This is the drawing room, as it would have been in the first few years of the museum being open. And it looks a little bit different to how it looks today, I think we can say. Particularly, actually, have a look at the floor in this photograph, because I don't know if you can tell, but it's actually a packed dirt floor here, which when the house was bought in the 40s and it was opened as the museum in 49, the Jane Austen Society had the money needed doing. So they fixed the roof, that was the main thing. But they also put down a wooden floor in the drawing room. So that's one thing that today is quite different. And you can also see these pieces of furniture in the room. These were the first objects, essentially, in the museum's collection. You can see they're all still to be seen in the museum today. You can see the chaise longue, the piano, that portrait above it of Jane Austen's nieces, and the bookcase that came from Steventon, and 2 chairs. So all of those are still in the room today. But we can see, if we carry on, we'll see why there are so few objects on display in this room. And it's because, of course, when you open a museum, when you buy a house, there's nothing in it, it's empty. So there's no collection. And it's probably not something that you'd think about if you're not starting up a new museum. But how do you begin a collection? How do you start acquiring one? So in this instance, the Jane Austen Memorial Trust started to buy things. And they also started to reach out. Obviously, it's still the 50s. The way of communicating with people is via advertisements in the papers. So they put out these notices calling for scraps and relics, anything to do with Jane Austen they wanted to have. And they really sort of swept in anything going that they could find. And I just think that's a really sort of amazing to imagine. They're sort of sweeping the country, they're finding out where things are, they're finding the relatives who might still have things, and people are sending things in and we're accepting them into the museum's collection. And Mr. Carpenter was really key to this story, because he made, alongside things being donated to the house, he made some of the sort of first and most important acquisitions for the museum's collection. And I particularly like these scraps in themselves, because the word scraps is quite pertinent in this circumstance. In this instance, scraps really just means anything to do with Jane Austen. But in the context of Jane Austen's writing, scraps is actually quite an important concept, because in the latter half of the 19th century, as Jane Austen was becoming more and more famous, her handwriting became incredibly sought after and valuable, and people would cut up, sort of autograph hunters would seek out bits of her writing. Obviously, if they could get her signature, that was great, but they didn't necessarily need that. They would take anything. So we do actually have an item in the collection called the sermon scrap, which is just a little sliver of paper cut from a sermon that she had copied out. So it's not even her own composition. It was simply valuable for being in her hand. However, in this instance, I think it is simply referring to anything that is at all connected with her. Many of the objects in the collection also came from the Jane Austen Society, and they acquired some of these key pieces. And this is Mr. Austen's bookcase, which came from Steventon Rectory. And Jane Austen would have known this object, this item of furniture, when she was a child. Her father would have worked at it. Some of his books would have been stored in it. You can imagine it being in his study and little Jane Austen sort of, running up to him whilst he's working, that kind of thing. And there's this rather lovely quote, which comes from the Jane Austen Society annual review. And it says that this is the Society's first major purchase. And I just love that real sort of pride that they have, that they've managed to acquire this really substantial and important piece of furniture that really links back to Jane Austen's past. But it wasn't just Mr. Carpenter and the Jane Austen Society who were bringing objects into the museum collection. There are also actually some really wonderful stories connected to how different objects came into the collection. And we're going to have a look at a couple of those. So firstly, I thought we'd start with something beautiful. These are 2 topaz crosses which belong to Jane and Cassandra, and they were given to the museum in 1974 by Charles Beecher Hogan, who was an American professor and Austen expert and a really extraordinary collector as well. And he presented them to the museum at the Jane Austen Society's annual meeting, which was held in Chawton. And the story goes that he had a pocket and he just sort of whipped them out to wow his audience after he'd finished his speech. And of course, these crosses are really valuable to us, but on several counts. And firstly, as objects that survive, that belonged to Jane and Cassandra, and actually very, very few pieces of Jane Austen's jewellery do survive. She probably didn't have much to start with, but there are only a handful of pieces that still survive. So these are sort of, in this very small, special group of objects. But they're also imbued with a really special meaning to Jane herself, as a valued present from her brother. So they were given to Jane and Cassandra by their youngest brother, Charles, with which he bought them for them as presents. So they were really valued by the sisters because of the family connection. But they're also really interesting and special, I think, because this, the trope of the Amber Cross also pops up in Mansfield Park when Fanny Price is given an Amber Cross by her brother William. And that crossover between life and literature is particularly pleasing because we know that Jane Austen's family would have completely understood it. And in many ways, she was writing for her family. She would read out, her novels, her writings, the chapter that she'd written that day, she'd read them out to the family in the evening. So we know that there are these in-jokes, and actually throughout her novels, there are family-specific jokes and references and stories and names that the family definitely would have picked up on, but that obviously her general readership don't necessarily see. Oh, sorry. Right, this is another one that I really love. So this is a portrait miniature of Mrs. Philadelphia Hancock. She's Jane Austen's aunt. She's the sister of her father. And it's a really beautiful miniature. It's by the English painter John Smart, who was right at the top of his game. He was a really wonderful miniaturist. It's tiny. So I don't know if you can see me at this point, but it's about this big. It was originally fitted onto a ring. So you can imagine it would have been quite large for a ring. It would have been sort of big signet ring kind of size, but it's really tiny thing. And it's surrounded by diamonds. It's incredibly beautiful. And Philadelphia is actually a wonderful character in her own right. And in this portrait, she's a beautiful young woman. She's actually recently been married. She looks like she could be the heroine of any Jane Austen novel. But we're not going to get stuck on Philadelphia. Something that I really love about this object is how it came to be in the museum collection at all. So to begin with, the story looks quite simple. Mr. Carpenter buys it in a Bond Street shop in 1950. He is alerted to the fact that it's there. He goes to the shop, talks to the owner, finds out who the previous owner had been. He buys it, and then he writes to the previous owner of the miniature, which was a Mrs. Purvis, and he asks if she has any more details about the history, the provenance of the object. He wants to know more. And she writes back to him, and she says that if she had known where the object was going to come to, where the miniature was going to end up, if she'd known about the existence of the museum at all, then she would have actually wanted to donate it to the museum. So she asks him if he can possibly sell it back to her and then she will donate it, which she proceeds to do. And it takes a little while, but she manages to get it back to the museum as a gift in time for the Queen's coronation in June 1953. And at the same time, she donated £1,000 to the trust and became, in Mr. Carpenter's words, the trust's greatest benefactress, which I love because it reminds me of Lady Catherine de Bourgh, although in a good way. And since then, the museum has been incredibly lucky, and we've had many other benefactresses and indeed benefactors. And this is another one. I'm going to show you another object given by one of our benefactresses. And this is another one of my favorite how the object came to the house stories. And I think, if I'm honest, it's actually also one of my favorite objects because it's just so unexpected and strange. But this is a lock of Jane Austen's hair. And it's in a rather beautiful glass frame. And if you're thinking it looks the wrong colour, then you're right, it is. It's faded. Jane Austen was a brunette, and this is very pale hair, but it has actually been DNA tested, so we know that it's right. It was presented to the museum in 1949 at the opening of the museum itself. And it was presented in rather a dramatic way by Mrs. Henry J. Burke of Baltimore. And the Burkes, they lived in America. They lived in Baltimore. They had this wonderful Jane Austen collection. It's extraordinary. And now most of it is housed at Goucher College in Maryland. But they're there at the opening of the house in 1949. So you can imagine the scene. We're in a marquee in the grounds of Chawton House, and Mr. Carpenter is making a speech. So he stands up and he starts talking, lamenting the loss of Jane Austen related items to America. And I think that this is one of his pet bugbears. So he's getting quite into it, and he's perhaps not being very tactful, bearing in mind that there are Americans in the audience, so he's not really thinking about that. And he says that in particular, he's really worried and sad that the locks of Jane Austen's hair and her father's hair, which were recently sold at Sotheby's, have been lost to America. And at this, so Alberta sitting in the audience, and apparently what happens is she mutters under her breath, "I will give them the damned hair." And then she stood up in the crowd and she announced publicly that she was the person who had bought the locks of hair at Sotheby's and that she would be very glad to present them to the museum. And I just love to imagine the response that this met with. As I understand it, the marquee pretty much collapsed in the uproar. And I think we can imagine that the society was pleased by this gesture, and it's still probably one of our most extraordinary donation stories, and I think it's really one of our most extraordinary objects as well. So from the hair to something quite different, now we're starting to get inside the house. We're starting to get some tantalizing little glimpses of what the house looks like today, but we will get on to that, I promise you, and we will also come on to that interesting little table in the corner. But for now, I want to draw your attention to the black cast iron grate, which is in the dining room at the house. And this is a really special object. It's unassuming, and many visitors don't know its significance. But to tell this story, I think I'm going to use the words of Dorothy Darnell's obituary, which was in the Jane Austen Society annual report in 1953. And as you'll remember, Dorothy Darnell was the founder of the Jane Austen Society, which began sort of the road to the museum being set up in the first place. So this is a little bit from her obituary. The cast iron grate from the Austen's dining parlour had been removed to make way for a tenant's gas fire. She, Dorothy Darnell, found it thrown out on a heap of nettles. She arranged temporary shelter for it at the Curtis Museum in Alton. This was the first work of rescue and preservation accomplished by the Jane Austen Society. Not many months before her death, she saw the dining parlour added to the showpiece of the museum, with the grate restored to its traditional position. So, in many ways, this grate is really one of the catalysts that inspired Dorothy Darnell in the first place to set up the society and to put so much effort into rescuing the house. So perhaps in some ways, if the tenants hadn't thought that they would rather have a newfangled gas fire instead of the beautiful old open fireplace, then maybe none of it would have happened. But I'm very glad that it's back in place, and we can see it as it is now, as it ought to have been all the time. So now we're going to rush you forwards through the decades again, because in the last 70 years since the museum opened, there has been a lot going on in our quiet little corner of Chawton. And I'm just going to give you a couple of the highlights. So it's worth saying that the collection has grown immeasurably, and we'll talk about that, but it's still growing. And it's now an internationally acclaimed collection of objects relating to Jane Austen and her life and her works and her family. But along the way, there have been some funny little stories that I'd like to share. So there have been some squabbles. And one that I find particularly amusing is this one in the middle. So this is a piece from 1963, when it was fashionable for women to wear stiletto heels. And they weren't good for their feet, but they also really weren't good for the gorgeous old wooden floorboards in Jane Austen's house. And apart from the drawing room, they are all the original floorboards. So they're the ones that Jane Austen walked on. So they're hallowed. We need to keep them safe. They're precious. So Mr. Carpenter wasn't having any of this, obviously. So what does he do? Obviously, he writes to the paper. So he put a number, in fact, in the archive, there are quite a few of these. He wrote to various newspapers a number of times, and you can sort of trace the story as it evolves. So to start with, he's complaining, and then after a while he says that actually it's been sorted out now. And as I can glean from the newspaper cuttings, the way that it was sorted out was to tell the women to take their shoes off when they came inside. So that was all sorted very satisfactorily. I'm not sure if you can see the evening news one, or if we're covering it up. In fact, you're seeing my screen, so you can't see it. But I can tell you that it's a dispute about tea rooms, which is obviously very important as well. This is 1957. The authorities realised that a local woman had set up a tea room without the correct licence. So it's a tiny story in the history of the museum, but luckily for us, T. Edward Carpenter was a lawyer, so he took them on, and it was all sorted out very satisfactorily, I'm glad to say. Mrs. Jukes of Alton got to keep her tea room, and the visitors got to have their tea, which, you know, is really important. It's an institution, not only to the British museum goer, but certainly to anything associated with Jane Austen. And while we're here, I just thought I'd share this really lovely picture of T. Edward Carpenter with you. And he's here in a little bit older now, and he's sweeping leaves, which I just think is really telling. It's really charming, because the story of Jane Austen's house is really just one of people, really strong personalities and hard work and determination all the way. And this is another clipping. This one's from 1988, so we've skipped forward a few more years again. And it's an interesting one because it's just so true, and it still is really true today. Chawton has become a place of pilgrimage. People come from all over the world to visit Jane Austen's home, to see where she lived and wrote. And so by the 80s and the 90s, you know, things are going well. The museum has grown quite a lot. More and more rooms have been opened up. It's looking pretty good. It's getting quite a lot of visitors. But it is all about to go up a gear. And I imagine, if we're in the 90s now, I imagine that you can guess where I'm going next, because something happened in 1995 which really changed everything. And it's Pride and Prejudice. So this is, of course, you all know this. It's the BBC's adaptation of Pride and Prejudice, starring Jennifer Ely and Colin Firth. And Austen mania gripped the country. It was just Jane Austen fever everywhere you looked. And at the house, visitor figures doubled that year. They went from around 20,000 to around 40,000. In fact, that year, I think they were nearer 50,000. And they've never looked back. So we normally, obviously this year will sadly be a huge exception, but in a normal year, we would expect to have around 40,000 visitors, which is really pretty good going for a tiny literary house museum in the middle of nowhere. So we're in the 90s. In terms of what the house looks like inside, I think we've got to about here. So it's definitely recognizable. And you can see that little table in the corner again. This time it's displaying a kettle. I'm not quite sure. No, that's not quite right. But because we're on Zoom, I'm going to be able to work a little virtual wizardry for you and bring you up to date. This is the dining room as you see it today. And it's actually, I'm afraid it's just an example room. I'm not going to walk you through every room in the house. We don't have time. But I thought I'd show you this one because it's one of my favorite rooms in the house. And I think it does look very close to what it would have looked like when the Austens lived here. In the last 70 years, since the house opened as a museum, this room hasn't changed all that much, although now there are hellebards in the ceiling, which I find reassuring. And we've also acquired this beautiful grandfather clock in the corner and various objects. And of course, in the corner, and you can't see it very well, but I will show it to you a bit better, is that little table. And this is probably the most iconic object in the museum's collection. It's the one that makes most visitors stop in their tracks. Many people cry when they see it. It's so small, so modest. It's rather humbling, I think, because this is where Jane Austen wrote when she lived here. According to family tradition, this was the table she would write at. She'd place it by the dining room window or by a window for light because her eyesight was weak, so she needed to have really good light. And it's just so tiny and modest and not very practical in some ways, but it really speaks volumes for that idea that, you know, that she's writing wherever she can. So even Chawton, which is the best writing space she ever gets after Steventon, you know, she still doesn't have the big desk in the study. You know, she's still writing at this little table in the corner of the dining room, and yet she manages to create these extraordinary works. So after Jane Austen's death, the story of the table is a bit muddled. It actually gets given to one of the servants of the Austens, William Littleworth. And then in 1913, it finds its way back into the Knight family. And then in 1957, it's given to the Jane Austen Society for display at the house. So it's been here ever since. And now we're going to look at something much newer, because the walls of the dining room are papered in this vibrant green leaf pattern wallpaper. And it might feel a bit surprising, perhaps, but in fact, it's an exact replica of the paper which we believe to have been on the walls when Jane Austen was living here. And this is a new addition to the interpretation of the house. It actually went up last September, so it's still really new. And because we're on Zoom, rather than standing in the dining room, I can show you some behind the scenes images that you wouldn't get to see if you were at the house. So there is a bit of an advantage. So I'm going to take you into that little dive a little bit deeper into the story of the wallpaper, because it's just glorious and fascinating, and I think it's spectacularly effective. So in 2018, a conservator who was working in the dining room found this large, scrappy piece of wallpaper in a cupboard in the corner of the room. And this hole that you can see here at the top of the wallpaper, that was fitted around a pipe. So you can see it was just sort of, it was behind other bits of paper, and it was in the cupboard, and nobody'd seen it for, you know, hundreds of years. This strip of yellow and black at the top here, this is a narrow flocked wallpaper border, and it's from the same date. And so the museum was excited about it, and they worked with the conservator and with wallpaper experts to date this piece of paper. And it was possible to do that, which was just so unbelievably lucky, because on the back of the scrap, there's just a portion of a tax stamp which is really rare to find because the roll of wallpaper would only have been stamped once. But as wallpaper was only taxed until 1836, we know that this wallpaper would have been produced before that time. And it seems most likely that Edward had the house redecorated to some extent before his mother and sisters moved in. And we know that he was doing various works to the house then. He actually blocked up one of the windows that was facing onto the road. He cut another window in. We've got, there are estate records that show that he was doing various other bits and bobs to the building, just to sort of bring it up to scratch for his mother, which is totally understandable. So it seems most likely that the wallpaper was installed then, rather than just randomly at some other point before 1836. So obviously it's not absolutely definite, but we think it's most likely that this was the wallpaper that was in the room when the Austens were living there, when Jane Austen was there. So we knew that we had to put it back, and we had to try and get the room back as much as possible to what it was like when Jane was living there. So we worked with historic wallpaper specialists, Hamilton Weston, to recreate the wallpaper from that scrap. And this is these are some images of their work in progress. So on the left you can see the design beginning to take shape, and their artist is painstakingly working out, tracing and copying every leaf, working out the repeat, and it's quite a complicated one. So they're working out the design. And then here on the right, we've got the wallpaper in production, and it was actually hand blocked using that traditional technique, although we didn't use all the original materials. So when the original Regency wallpaper was produced, this really vibrant minty green colour would have been achieved using arsenic, and we didn't go quite that far. So not entirely authentic, but as far as we could do. And then here we are. So this is September last year, and the wallpaper was installed. And here we are today. This is the finished room. And the wallpaper, I think, has just changed the feel of the room so much. It is so much warmer and cozier than it was before. And it's quite interesting because when the wallpaper was still on the roll, before it had been put up on the walls, we were all a little bit scared of it. We thought it looked just too bright and garish. But now that it's in, I just can't imagine this room any other way. It just seems to fit it like a glove. And it's interesting to note, actually, that this kind of really bright, bold, slightly scary pattern is really typical of the Georgian taste. They just loved rich textures and bright colours, partly because they were expensive. So they indicated your wealth, and they signified that this was a room of importance. So this was a room that you would entertain in, a public space. But also, this kind of pattern is really practical. It hides the dirt. It's really busy and quite dark. So it's useful for that kind of way. And also, in a really dimly lit space, in a dimly lit era, these colours really work. So you've got to remember that when the Austens were living here, the only lighting, other than, daylight, would have been candles or the light from the fire. So actually, in winter, darkness falls at 4 o'clock. So that whole long winter evening, you're sitting in the dining room and there's a glow from the fire, and they have 1 or 2 candles lit. Somebody's reading aloud, the others are doing their needlework. These colours sort of help you to feel warmer and cozier than you really are. And I can tell you that in winter in Chawton, you need every bit of coziness that you can get. So we've come right up to date. This is the courtyard of the museum today, although sadly not actually today because it's been pouring with rain all day in Chawton. But a few weeks ago we had some beautiful sunshine, and this is what we're doing. And I've put up this picture because it kind of sums up, I think, what we're trying to do with the house at the moment. It's all about bringing life and character into those rooms the museum has this wonderful collection, but there's a challenge for literary museums in how do you show those objects in the right way. It's not a traditional museum. Sometimes putting glass cases in can break the spell. So we have to be innovative. And there is a degree of set dressing, because that really helps visitors, I think, to sort of step into the story, go back in time, because that's what people really want to do when they come here. And because it's Jane Austen, not only do we want to imagine that she might just be loitering around the next corner, but we also want to bump into Lizzie Bennet or Eleanor Dashwood or Fanny Price or Anne Elliot or any of our favourite characters. We want the house to summon them all up for us. So it's about authenticity, but it's also about imagination and atmosphere and summoning up that spirit of place, which, I don't know, that to help visitors step into it really easily. And now I'm going to invite you over, because we are actually open, albeit not in quite the way that we would have envisaged. You do have to book, because, you know, that helps us know who's coming. But that is a good thing, because it means that you definitely have your place reserved. And actually, I think it's a really lovely time to visit the museum, because the house is never busy. We're controlling numbers really strictly, keeping them really low. So you have a really lovely visitor experience. And whilst I really hope you've enjoyed hearing about the house and the collection, there is just nothing like seeing it in person. And there is so much more to see. And I feel like I've been talking for a long time now, but I've really only just scratched the surface of the objects and the rooms in the house that you will want to see and enjoy. So thank you very much. And I'm going to hand back over to Diana, and we'll take some questions.
Well, that was absolutely lovely, Sophie. Thank you very much. It was really good to see things close up, and also to have the history of the house, because one might know something, but one doesn't know all the fine details. So getting the fine detail was really good.
Good.
Now we've got a lot of, I can see quite a lot of people. We've got Nikki Morrison, we've got Michael, we've got Betty Sue Shah. Somewhere. I think we had, we've got Jude Harris again. I think I saw somebody that we had the other evening, Stuart Reynolds. So we've really got quite a lot of people. Oh, we've got Sabine as well. Well, you're all extremely welcome. Now, have we got anybody with a question? That's the important thing. If we have, could you unmute yourselves, and if you can, put on your video so we can see you, so you can put your hand up and wave so that we know you're asking a question. I don't see anybody. Let me just go back a bit to see. Oh yes, we've got Jonathan, we've got Sabine, we've got Jude, we've got Michael.
Diana,
right, well that's a good start.
Diana, there are 50 people here tonight. It's a double screen. There's 25 and then another 25. There's 50 people here.
Oh wow. Oh, I've got a question from Jill Crowley to everyone. Which cross belonged to Jane and which belonged to Cassandra?
Oh,
yes.
I know.
We all want to know that.
It's the $1 million question. We actually don't know. For years, it was believed that the more attractive one belonged to Jane, but I think that may have been wishful thinking. So of the two, one is a baguette cut, which is the kind of longer, more square cut, and it was thought that that one belonged to Jane, but I actually don't think there is any evidence for that, so we simply don't know. But there is a bit of an idea that whilst they owned one each, perhaps they shared them a little bit. They were so close, they shared a bedroom. They were a couple of years apart, so I don't think it's impossible that they would have swapped occasionally.
Yeah, well, fair enough. Right, anybody else with a question? Right, yes, Joe?
Yes, thank you. First of all, Sophie, thank you. That was terrific, really, really enjoyable. And I've never been to the house before, but I feel as if I have now. But it won't stop me going in person, so don't worry. So I've got a question, but before that, I just want to let everyone else know that you can ask questions in the chat by if you want to write your questions, or you can just wave your hand around, or there's also the reactions button down the bottom. You can sort of use one of these symbols to ask a question. I was just going to ask you, Sophie, I think you touched on it briefly, but what would have been the arrangements for domestics and domestic staff for the family?
Yeah, so the Austens didn't have a huge amount of money, but they would have had a couple of servants. We think they had a manservant and then 2 maids who would have worked in sort of various areas. And we think that the manservant would have slept in the attics. So Jane wrote a letter before they moved to Chawton. She wrote a letter specifically saying that, you know, we've been told that there are attics and that's good, so the manservant can sleep there. And we don't know exactly where the maids would have slept. One thing that's a little bit frustrating about the house now is that because of that period where there were tenants living in the house, some changes were made, particularly to the upstairs. And there's evidence that some walls have been moved, which is just really inconvenient. But there would have been a couple of small rooms up there, and presumably the maids would have had one of those, but we don't know for sure. Unfortunately, it's really inconsiderate that Jane Austen didn't draw a little plan and make some notes about exactly what was going on where. That would be really useful.
Yeah, wouldn't it? I've got a question here. Wait a minute. Is there a book or booklet about the founders of the House Museum? This is from Kathy.
There isn't. There's a museum guidebook, which, but I think that's only sold on site at the museum. But it's something that when I started work at the house, it was in November 2018, and the first project that I worked on was the 70th anniversary, which was in 2019, was just coming up. So as soon as I started, I kind of dived into this story of how the house was founded and how it was set up, and how the collection was gathered together. And it's such a fantastic story, and it's something that I would absolutely love there to be a book about it. So it's definitely up there. It's a project for one day, or perhaps if somebody is inspired to do it, I don't know.
Yeah. I've got another question from Sally. You said there was a plaque on the wall before the house was purchased. When was it put up and by whom?
Yes, good spot. So there are 2 plaques on the wall, and one of them I showed, and that was the one that memorialized the opening of the museum. The other one is quite a lot older. It was put up in 1917 for the first centenary of Jane Austen's death. And it was actually put up by a kind of forerunner of the Jane Austen Society in a way. It was put up by a memorial committee who came together specifically just to raise money to commission and to put up this plaque. And it was funded by a group of Jane Austen fans in the UK, but also in America. So obviously today, the Jane Austen Society of North America, which also at that point hadn't been founded, is a really big, powerful, strong, really great band of people that love Jane Austen over in the States. So in a way, it was a forerunner of that and a forerunner of the Jane Austen Society in the UK, but they didn't stay together. They came together, raised the money for the plaque, got it up on the house, and then disbanded.
Another question from Eliza. I remember reading about a turquoise ring that belonged to Jane Austen and was bought by an American pop star before the purchase was stopped in order for it to stay in the UK. Is it in Chawton? What happened to it?
Yes, you're quite right. And it's another one of those amazing stories. And the collection, and actually probably all museum collections, are just full of these extraordinary stories. So this, for anyone that doesn't know, in 2018, Jane Austen's turquoise ring came up for auction, and it's one of these objects. The provenance was impeccable. There's nothing about the ring itself to link it to Jane Austen, and Jane Austen never wrote saying, I own a turquoise ring, or, oh, I went and bought a turquoise ring. But this provenance letter that accompanies the ring absolutely identifies it on Jane Austen's death, Cassandra inherited the ring. On her death, she left it to one of her female relatives, and it passed down through the female line right up until 2018, at which point the descendant decides to sell it. Presumably they need the money, and it is bought by the American pop star Kelly Clarkson, who it turns out is a huge Jane Austen fan. Who knew? However, luckily for us, there was an export ban put on it, and we were given not very long, actually I can't remember, a number of weeks to raise 100 grand to buy the ring, because that's how it works. You have to buy it at the price that it was bought originally at auction if you're going to keep it in the country. So we launched a public appeal to save the ring, and it was overwhelming. The response from the public was just incredible, and within a few hours the money was raised, I think. I didn't work there at the time, but it's kind of come down in the annals of the museum's history as this extraordinary time. And so the museum owns it now, and it's on display in Chawton, and it sits there in a case alongside the turquoise, the amber crosses, and it's a really lovely piece because it's so tiny. Again, it's one of these things that material culture is so strange, because in many ways this little ring doesn't look like much, but it's the fact that Jane Austen would have worn it just makes it extraordinary. And it's so tiny, it gives you a sense of her little fingers, little hands. She was a very delicate person. So yes, short answer to your question. You can come and
Well,
see it.
good. Well, we've now got a question for Sabine. What is known about the piano in the house? Was it the one Jane Austen played?
Yeah, so sadly, it's not the exact same piano. That piano has presumably long gone, but it is the right period and it is the right make. It's a Clementi, so it is the sort that Jane Austen had. And it actually is owned by Hampshire Cultural Trust, but it's been on loan to the museum since the 50s. So it's really, it's taken up residence in the house. And I'm afraid I'm not a piano expert, so I don't know much more about it than that, except that obviously because it's the same make and it's been so beautifully restored, it has the right sound, it has the right sort of timbre. And when we're not in a global pandemic, visitors are welcome to play the piano if they play the piano, or we have various pianists who come in and play, and it creates just a wonderful atmosphere in the house. It's such a small house, and the acoustic throughout, because it's all wood, there's this wonderful acoustic throughout the house. So if somebody's sitting in the drawing room and playing the piano, you can hear it wherever you are. So because we're now obviously in completely different measures at the moment, and there's no piano playing going on, so we have actually commissioned a local pianist who has made us a very simple audio which now sits, tiny little speaker which sits in the drawing room and plays the piano music, so that at least we still have the sound of it, even though we don't quite have the wonderful playing. But yeah, so it's a wonderful piece. It's so atmospheric and evocative.
Well, we've got a question from Jonathan. Yes, hello.
Hello. I noticed in the dining room there were no pictures on the walls.
Yeah.
Was that as it was then, or is it just because you haven't got the right pictures to put?
I think it's because there were, up until last autumn, there were lots of pictures on the walls. But when we put up the beautiful new wallpaper, we couldn't bear to spoil it too quickly. Everyone was feeling so precious about it. It's this incredibly expensive, beautiful handmade paper. So we didn't put anything up. But we have actually, just last week, we put a mirror above the fireplace, and that had to be screwed into the wall. So I think we're getting our nerve together now. We don't know what the Austens would have had on the walls. It would have been quite typical in that period to have a big picture or mirror over the mantelpiece. I don't know if they would have had little pictures on the walls as well, because we are half reenacting, half recreating Jane Austen's experience and half a museum trying to display the collection. Most of the rooms in the house do have lots of pictures, because that's a canvas for displaying, pieces from the collection. But we are trying to strike that balance. So I think maybe we'll try to keep the dining room as authentic feeling as possible. So maybe, I'm not sure, maybe 1 or 2 more pictures will go up, but we'll try not to have quite that gallery effect that, you know, that there was before.
Yes, I think the mirror over the mantelpiece would be very accurate. I'm sure she would have had a mirror.
Yeah.
Maybe a large picture, but a mirror seems to be right. So I shall look forward to seeing that. Do we have any other questions? That anybody going to put anything in the chat room?
What about the books that Jane Austen might have read? Do you have a collection of those?
So we do have a small number of books that she owned. They are few and far between because, very sadly, when the Austens upped and moved from Steventon and moved to Bath, most of their possessions were sold. And we know that Mr. Austen, Jane's father, had a really impressive library, but it was broken up. So a couple of volumes survive from Jane's childhood. There are 1 or 2 volumes which have her name in the front, and that there's one that was given to her by her cousin for her birthday. We've got a really an extraordinary book called Elegant Extracts, which was, I think, supposed to be improving pieces for, you know, young girls to enjoy and learn from. We've got a book called Mentoria, which is kind of a similar sort of thing. But no, we don't have the whole library, which, I mean, it's sad for us, but I think it was also just devastating for her, because she's 21 and she's, you know, lived in this house her whole life, and then suddenly the whole thing is broken up, and the books are really her lifeline. And one of the things that actually I wanted to talk about, and there wasn't really time to squeeze this in, but Jane Austen's education is so scanty. She goes to school, you know, for a few months and comes back. She goes when she's 7. She goes to school again, comes back home when she's 10. Her formal education is over. So for the rest of her sort of, you know, teenage years, I suppose, the sort of period when you think of as your sort of the time when you're having your education today, anyway, you'd think of that. She's really on her own, and her father takes boys into the household as sort of live-in pupils. So possibly he taught the girls a little bit as well, but in general, Jane and Cassandra taught themselves by reading. And one of the lovely things that we know about Mr. Austen is that he was very open with his library, and he trusted the girls to read whatever they wanted. So they could go into his pretty impressive library of several hundred books, and they could read very widely. And we know, you know, people have done sort of studies on this, going through her letters and her novels and pulling out all the allusions to writers and books and sort of drawing together lists of what we think she must have read. But unfortunately, she didn't own very many books herself. The other thing is that in that period, she used circulating libraries a lot. So she would take a book out and give it back, and there's no record anywhere of what it was, unless she wrote a letter to Cassandra telling her about it. And she does that a bit. But yeah, so sadly, not only do we not have the books, but we also don't necessarily know exactly what they would have been.
Yeah, she's also, before she left Steventon, she sold a lot of her own books, didn't she? So yes, a bit sad.
She had to travel light.
Yes. Now, do we have anybody else? Yes, Joe, I can see your hand waving.
Sorry to ask another one, but Sophie, is there any object related to Jane of which you are aware that is not currently at Chawton that you would love to get your hands on?
Oh, yes, good question.
Gotcha.
There are a lot of objects which are still out there, and this is one of the things that's quite interesting about working for Jane Austen's house, is that if you work for an art gallery or, you know, a museum that collects something in a different line, then you might know it might be very well catalogued what's out there, and you just have to wait until it comes up for sale. With Jane Austen, objects connected to Jane Austen, we don't necessarily know what's out there at all. what we do know is that there is bound to be lots, because as Jane Austen became more and more famous and more revered, these objects became more and more valuable. And because she has such a large family, because, you know, 6 of her brothers had families, they all had masses of children, and they all had masses of children. There are so many descendants from the Austen family now, and we know that there are lots of objects out there that the descendants from the family still have. Obviously, there are a few that we know about in particular. There's a portrait, actually, at the National Portrait Gallery, so we don't have that one. But there's a nice story about it, because it came up for auction, I think in 1950, and rather sweetly, Mr. Carpenter tried to buy it, and he took the National Portrait Gallery on at auction, and he lost, obviously. But he went to them and he said, you know, I wanted to buy it for my museum, so can I have a copy? And I guess it was before there was anything like a photocopier. So what they did was they let him commission an artist to go in and make a replica. So we have our own Cassandra's portrait by a lady called Marjorie Dodd, who was an artist who made the replica. And then she decided, and this is just so typical, so many people have done this in the history of the museum, but having worked for a fee, she then decided that actually she wanted to donate it to the museum because she just thought it was so wonderful. So we do have that. And we have a number of quite similar things like that. So when I was talking about the very, very early days of the museum and how the Society and Mr. Carpenter put out these calls for scraps, and they took in anything that anyone offered, it was literally true. Anything that anyone offered, they took in. So we have a number of photographs of portraits, for example, in the collection, a number of photographs of portrait miniatures. We don't own the portrait, and we would absolutely love to, but that's still owned by a member of the family, but we do have a copy. So, you know, we're sort of getting there. So some of those things we know they're out there. We know that those portraits are out there. We know that there's a lot of family silver. The Knight family still very connected with the museum and with Chawton House, and we know we have a number of objects on loan from them. So a number of, you know, really beautiful Wedgwood pieces of dinner service, things like that. But yeah, there is more out there to be discovered, I'm sure.
Gosh, it's a bit like a detective story.
It is. And if anyone knows of anything, or if anyone's got anything, then, you know, let me know. Put it in the chat.
Well, there you are, the challenge.
Yeah.
Do we have any more questions? I can see Dilys is there. She was here the other evening. I've got a Jill. I don't think we've seen Jill before. Who else? Got a Hazel. I'm not quite sure which Hazel that might be. It's really nice that we have so many people, and so many have come back. I can see Katie Butler. She's come back again. Do any of you have another question?
Dilys.
Put it in the. Oh, hang on. I've got one here. Oh, from Dilys. Yes, Dilys, you have put one.
Yeah.
Do you have a library of books about Jane Austen?
Yes, we do. We have a reference library, but it's a bit scattergun, I think I'd say. A lot of them have been donated. So where we're pretty good, actually, is in lots of foreign translations of the novels and of biographies about Jane Austen. So we have a really great international library. And we do have a reference library, but we're slightly put in the shade because we're, you know, a couple of 100 yards from Chawton House, which is the most wonderful library of women's 19th century literature. So we don't tend to boast about our library too much because we're really nothing in comparison, but it is there and it is accessible. And we do have researchers who come to the house, not, I have to say again at the moment, but, you know, in normal circumstances. We have, we're open to researchers coming to the house and using the collection, in particular the objects, because whilst the library isn't so much to boast about, we do have a really wonderful collection of Jane Austen's letters. So many of those, of the, I think 136, something like that, survive. Many of those are in America, but we have 13 of them. So researchers quite often, students quite often like to come in and see those at the house and to see other parts of the collection.
Thank you for that. And I've got another question here from Fred. I think this is specifically for you personally, Sophie. How has working at the house and learning more about Jane changed your own thoughts on the books and life in general?
Yeah.
What a big question.
It is a big question. Yeah, it's a tough one. I think it has helped me understand how much other people love Jane Austen, because I think it's very easy to, particularly when it's a writer, because reading is such a solitary thing. I grew up reading Jane Austen, and I knew that I loved her, and I knew that she was probably the best writer in the world. But I don't think I really thought about the fact that anyone else thought that. And I wasn't aware of this huge sort of weight of history of loving Jane Austen. And it is an extraordinary thing. So many people feel like I do, which I just didn't know. And you just see it in people who come around the house, because so many people, particularly you notice it, I think, in international visitors, because so many people base their whole holiday to the UK around coming to Chawton. I mean, it's just so amazing. So I think it's actually, to respond to a big question with, a huge statement, I think maybe it's helped me understand a little bit more about human nature. I mean, and also the power of Jane Austen, because I don't think I quite understood how much she meant to people, but why? I think I just knew that I loved her work and I loved reading her novels. And I came to the museum as someone who worked in museums to, look after the collection. And I think I've sort of put those two things very much together. And, I'm just so lucky, because in lots of people work in museums and they look after things that they don't necessarily care about in the same, in that way. So yeah,
perfectly true. Well, has it? Oh, I've got a couple of thank yous here. One from Debbie. Thank you for a wonderful evening. And there's a sad one here from Jill. Well, a little bit sad. The talk was so interesting because I was supposed to visit there with Jasna this summer. Oh, Jill, that is so sad. Oh, well, you'll have to come back next summer, hopefully.
Come back next year. Yeah, absolutely. Hopefully by next summer, everything will be back to normal.
But I'm not optimistic, but maybe in a couple of years.
Where are you speaking from, Jill?
I'm about an hour from Boston, Massachusetts.
Oh, right. So you're in that is a shame. Well, you've got next year and maybe the year after that.
The year after, yeah.
We'll still be here. Whenever you manage to come, we'll be here.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, well, never mind. But, you have at least seen something tonight. Better than nothing. Now, do we have any more questions from anybody? I can't see all the screen. This is the trouble.
Well, there are 50 people here, Diana.
I know. I'm clicking away like mad, trying to see who else is here. But they're not all on my screen.
Yeah, but there's two arrows. There's two arrows on each side of the screen.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, my own screen.
It's okay, Don. I'm checking. I don't think there's any more questions immediately, unless anyone has a last bid for a question.
Well, in that case, I'm going to thank Sophie very, very much. It was absolutely lovely. Really, really good. And we've got a few people clapping. I know you can't hear them, but it really was a lovely evening. Thank you very, very much indeed. Thank you, Joe, for facilitating it. And can I just put a little bit of a word in for tomorrow night? Saturday, we've got Jane Austen and the Slave Trade. The speaker is Karen Fernald, and she was going to give this particular talk at Chawton last July for the AGM. So we're very lucky to have her to do that. Then on Sunday, we've got a quiz, a light-hearted quiz. You don't have to know everything. And then in the evening, we've got readings. So we're ending up with Jane Austen's own words. So maybe we'll see some of you for one or two of those things. Anyway, thank you again, Sophie. It's been really a lovely evening. Thank you very, very much. Thank you all for coming along. It's been lovely to have you.
Coming, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So night to everybody.
Yeah, bye.
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 Bye.